America's Book Club is brought to you by these television companies and is supported by the Ford Foundation. From the nation's iconic libraries and institutions, America's Book Club takes you on a powerful journey of ideas, exploring the lives and inspiration of writers who have defined the country, in conversation with civic leader and author David Rubenstein.
As a young boy growing up in Baltimore, I went to my local library and was inspired to read as many books as I could. Hopefully people will enjoy hearing from these authors, and hopefully they'll want to read more.
Now, from the historic Decatur House in Washington, D.C., best-selling author of more than a dozen books, including his deeply personal Losing Mum and Pop, son of conservative writer William F. Buckley. Christopher Buckley.
Well, let me just welcome Chris Buckley to America's Book Club. We are at the Decatur House, which is an historic house right near the White House. And thank you for coming down from your home in Connecticut to do this.
I'm delighted to be here, and I came on the brand new Acela. And just as I was writing my wife to say how cool it was, it moved sideways.
Oh.
But here I am.
Okay,
No,
all right, you survived.
No, it's a lovely train, and I'm very glad there's a
So you have written 20 books, many of them satires. Satire is a lost art a bit. I don't see that many satirists that are best-selling authors.
There are. Carl Hyacin, Dave Barry, although they might be more classified as humorists.
A difference between a satire and a humorist, you would say, is?
Hundreds of thousands of sales. George Kaufman, the great Broadway impresario and writer, I think defined satire as the thing that opens on Saturday and closes on Sunday.
So you think satire doesn't sell as much as humor?
I think humor, I think there have been some hugely successful humorists. Here we are in Washington, once the home of Art Buchwald, who banged out one bestseller after another on top of his daily column in the Post. Irma Bombeck, I'm sure you all remember. People of that caliber, they bless their hearts, they just minted money. I'm a rounding. My sales amount to a rounding error.
Well, I don't think that's true. Your books were bestsellers, and we'll go through some of them in a moment. I'd like to go through your background, though, for a moment. Some people would say you had a complicated background to be a satirist, because usually satirists come from, let's say, the bottom part of society, and maybe they see the humor of life as they work their way up. But you came from really the top of society. Your father was William F. Buckley, Jr., one of the most famous people in our country, the latter part of the 20th century, famous political commentator, Republican leader, thought leader, writer, 57 books I think he wrote, and several, I think 30-some years on Firing Line, right?
57 books, 1,504 episodes of Firing Line, which he was he had the record as the longest running single host of a program. 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 syndicated columns over the years, innumerable essays. And yet he still, every Friday night would find him on his boat out for a sail in Long Island Sound.
So you were your parents' only child. Your mother was from Canada.
She was from, yes, Vancouver, British Columbia. She was an orchid. She was a debutante. Her father was an old-fashioned industrialist. He racehorses, gold mines, the whole works. And I remember Henry Kissinger at her memorial service said, Pat Buckley used to say, "I'm just a simple girl from the backwoods of British Columbia." And all I can say is, if Pat Buckley was a simple girl from the backwoods of British Columbia, I would tremble to meet a complicated one.
Well,
She became a sort of a, she was like a character in a Noel Coward play, crossed with a snapping turtle.
So she
A
was
remarkable woman.
one of the great fashion leaders in New York society, I would guess it's fair to say. And your father was one of the great intellectual leaders in the country. And you were the only child. Now, I'm an only child. My parents did not graduate from high school. So,
But you've done rather well.
but it's working your way up from that background is actually probably easier than having a famous father who's an intellect and a mother who's loved by everybody in New York. So how did you develop your own style to write satire, where I wouldn't have thought that your background would have led you into satire?
I don't, it's a perfectly good question, David. I don't really quite have an answer. There was no point in my youth when I woke up one morning and said, I'm going to be a satirist.
Were you funny? Did you tell jokes? How did you get this sense of humor that you obviously have?
My mother was a very, very witty woman. One of her last bon mots before she died in 2007, where she was talking about someone and said, "That person is so stupid he ought to be caged." That was very, very mum. She was an extraordinarily witty person. If she had taken up a pen and written, she would have been a sort of a Park Avenue Dorothy Parker, if you will. And Pop, my father, had, the second best sense of humor.
So when you're growing up, you
And
grew up
whether or
in-
not, yeah, I suppose you absorb certain traits from your parents, but it's not a direct transplant.
But when you have a famous father, as famous as William F. Buckley Jr., and he was known for being very conservative, when you're a child, can you avoid the challenge of being his son? I mean, in other words, smoking drugs, drinking alcohol, doing things that might be considered inappropriate for a teenager of William F. Buckley. Was that a problem for you, or you had that perfectly did whatever you wanted?
I managed to have my cake and eat it too. Fortunately, there were no disasters of the type that, very often.
When you started writing, did you show your work to your father, and did he say, "This is brilliant, I'm really proud of you," or not so much?
No. If it was good, I would get a pat in the back. He was the most supportive father anyone could have dreamt of, but he was incorruptible. He would I remember, and this was fairly late in life too, and I had written some piece that did not please him, and I walked into his study and he said, "Oh, well, I don't suppose we'll be reading that in one of your anthologies." But he was, he always impressed upon me that, and others, that it would be terribly unfair to encourage someone in writing who did not have the talent.
Were you as politically conservative as your father was? He was the leader of the conservative movement to some extent.
Very much. I mean, George Will does a sort of reverse engineering. Ronald, if it hadn't been for Ronald Reagan, we wouldn't have won the Cold War. If it hadn't been for Barry Goldwater, there wouldn't have been a Reagan. If there hadn't been a Bill Buckley, there wouldn't have been a Goldwater. Therefore, Bill Buckley won the Cold War.
So that's,
Well,
when you were growing up, you went to a boarding school. Did your
No,
father?
I was sent.
You were sent to a boarding school.
There's a difference.
You were sent to a boarding school. But when you went there, did people say, well, you're William F. Buckley Jr.'s son, you have to be very conservative? Or were you not known that time for that kind of parentage?
Kids are kids, and they sense vulnerabilities. There was an upperclassman. I don't think I can say this word on C-SPAN, but he was not a pleasant fellow. And he would do things like take a newspaper photograph of my father with a swastika drawn on the forehead and, paste that to my door. So there are experiences
Were you
like
were you a writer when you were in prep school? Did you start writing then?
I did. I wrote short stories for the school literary magazine that I could not bear to reread. But I was, I think it's safe to say I was an overachiever, which is to say I was, punching, below my weight. I very, very much wanted to write. And so I wrote.
You applied to many colleges. I think you got in everywhere you applied. But why did you go to Yale? Because your father was famous for being a Yaley who didn't really like Yale. Was that going to be difficult for you?
No, he loved Yale. He never stopped loving Yale.
That he wanted you to go to Yale?
He never said a word. And then when it came time to choose, and I chose, I remember his face sort of lit up, and he said, we spoke in Spanish when we had something, critical, interesting to convey.
Your father's first
language?
language?
He said, me alegre. That makes me happy.
Well, your father's first language was Spanish.
His first language was Spanish. His second language was French. And he learned English in London, age 7. So a lot of people, when people said, why do you sound the way you do? He would tell them that and say, how am I supposed to sound?
But it was an unusual accent.
And I'd also point out his mother was from New Orleans.
Oh.
And his father was from Texas, whose father had been a sheriff of Duval County. So he grew up in a culturally Southern
Did he walk around with a dictionary all the time? He had all these big words he always was using, or was that part of his?
No, he wasn't. He wasn't pedantic. He didn't. I never saw him sort of memorizing the Oxford English Dictionary. He was often berated, which I think was, well, inappropriate. But people saying, why do you use such long words? And he said, well, I use words that were invented because at the time they were invented, there was a precise need for that word. And I think that's a perfectly valid point. I mean, an analogy would be saying to a painter, why do you use all those colors? Why can't you just use primary colors? Why do you need,
right.
Green cyanothane?
So you would go to Yale. Were you a writer at Yale?
I was on the Yale Daily News.
Okay, so did you write humor then, or satire?
No. Well, I didn't write humor, but the magazine that I edited with John Tierney, the Yale, we sort of were to the side of the Yale Daily News. We edited the Yale Daily News magazine, whose staff consisted of me, John Tierney, Michiko Kakutani, Lloyd Grove, Jackson Deal. And Jane Mayer. That's a pretty good bench. And we had a lot of fun doing it.
So when you graduated from Yale, what did you decide to do?
I went to work as a junior editor at Esquire magazine.
Okay, and were you writing humor on the side, or?
No, no, the humor didn't. The humor didn't come until later.
Later. So,
It was a knock, knock.
well, eventually you got a job working as a speechwriter for Vice President Bush.
I did.
What was that like? How did you get that job?
Well, life is often a series of accidents, some happy, some less happy. I had I was writing now for Esquire, and I'd written a straightforward journalistic piece on Mexico's oil boom. And a guy named Pete Teeley, who was Mr. Bush's press secretary, had read it. And I'd met him once at a party. Now, Pete, who is the best of his breed of political press operators, Pete was not the kind of guy to launch a 6-month talent search for Mr. Bush's speechwriter. He had a cold typewriter, and he needed someone to warm it. And my phone rang, and he said, how'd you like a job? And how do you turn down a job at the White House? I had never written a speech, but
So it worked out?
Apparently.
You were there for 2 years?
I was there for 2 years. Yeah, I one night I threw all my possessions in the back of my Volkswagen Red Rabbit convertible. I drove down to start my life in Washington, and I got lost. I took the wrong exit off the Beltway, and I came in on New York Avenue, and suddenly I look up, and there's the white dome of the Capitol gleaming. And it really, I hope it doesn't sound mawkish, but, it was, I still get choked up thinking about that. It was sort of like it was a Mr. Smith goes to Washington moment.
How do you like writing speeches for Vice President Bush? And when he became president, why didn't you stay with him?
Well, because I didn't look at speech writing as a life pursuit. And I had no intention of going into politics, which is to say, starting out as a speechwriter, and then you're a deputy assistant undersecretary for cleaning ashtrays in the Interior Department, and then 40 years later, you're ambassador to Cape Verde Islands. So that was never, one of my. While I worked for Mr. Bush for 2 years, and I came to revere George Bush. He and my father and my Uncle Jimmy maybe are the two finest men I've ever known.
So when you left, did you go back to writing for Esquire or other magazines?
No, I did, yes. But I also, while I was at the White House, I became fascinated by the White House memoirs that everyone who has worked in the White House for more than 10 minutes writes. Generally, they're 500 pages, and they have the words power and principle in the title, power, principle, and parking. And anyway, so I became sort of fascinated by this, and it occurred to me to write. This would be the appearance of humor, this humor that you're so obsessed with. And I thought it would be fun to write a parody of a White House memoir. And I did. And
That's
it's
called?
Called The White House Mess. And it came out in 1986. It got a very nice review from Jonathan Yardley of the Post. So this was a very big deal for me. It starts. It came out in 1986. The novel starts on January 20th, 1989. when the new president is pulling up to the White House to escort the outgoing President Reagan to the Capitol for the inaugural ceremony. But it turns out there's a problem. Mr. Reagan is still in his pajamas, and he just doesn't feel like leaving. So it falls to the very resourceful press secretary named Mike Feely, carefully disguised, to figure out a way to get Mr. Reagan to leave without injecting him, with a sleeping agent. And that scene sort of caused the book to catch on.
Did Reagan want to stay in the White House, or
he wasn't being defiant. He just didn't feel, he was getting a little bit, dotty, and he just didn't feel like leaving. And so in 1986, when the book came out, the notion of a US president refusing to leave was a quaint notion. That was then.
So when you write satire and it becomes actually real history, you realize you got to write something else. But let me ask you, after that book, you then wrote a couple other satires?
I wrote, I wrote the book that I suppose, I wrote a novel called Thank You for Smoking.
Now that was made into a movie.
That was made into a movie, yeah.
And Thank You for Smoking is, the premise of the book is that you have a lobbyist for smoking, and then what happens?
Well, he's an anti-hero. I mean, he's likable, but he works for the Tobacco Institute. The idea occurred while years ago. I was watching the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour, as it was then called, and they had on a scientist who had just come up with, the 999th bit of scientific evidence establishing that smoking is not good for you. But for balance, they had on this very attractive woman who worked for the Tobacco Institute. Anyway, she was sort of the chief lobbyist, and she sort of looked like Lauren Bacall. She was very, very attractive. Every time the scientist adduced something scientific, and this was a guy with so many PhDs at the end of his name, wouldn't all fit on a business card. And every time he said, well, there's, we did the coalictin receptor number 19, she would go, oh, please. As if he was, and I fell in love. I thought, what a fascinating job that must be.
So what's the premise of the book?
Well, the sales are in decline, and so he comes up with the idea of going out to Hollywood and basically bribing producers and directors to have more smoking in their films. And his name is, the tobacco lobbyist is named Nick Naylor, and his two best friends are the spokesman for the liquor industry and the spokesman for the NRA. And they get together, once a week and sort of tell war stories and sob on each other's shoulders. And they call themselves the Mod Squad, which stands for Merchants of Death.
What ultimately happens to this smoking advocate?
Well, I don't want to give away the plot of a book that was published in 1994. But there's a scene where he is kidnapped, Nick, by we don't know who, and they cover him head to toe in nicotine patches. I called a doctor friend of mine at the time when I was writing that scene, and I said, I've covered him with nicotine patches, but I need him to live. Would he live? He said, absolutely not. I said, well, how many nicotine patches would it take? He said, 3, 4. So I had to change that scene. In the movie, he escapes and ends up deranged in the lap of the statue of Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial, covered head to toe in nicotine patches.
Who played this character in the movie?
Aaron Eckhart.
Okay, so
The movie was adapted by a guy named Jason Reitman, who's the son of Ivan Reitman of Animal House and Ghostbusters fame. And Jason, he was 27 years old at the time, and he's gone on to very much bigger things. And if you look at the credits of Thank You for Smoking, you'll see 3 interesting names in the executive producer line: Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and Elon Musk and Peter Thiel.
do you have any contact with them?
No, it was produced, it was a guy named David Sachs, whose name now appears quite regularly, made the movie happen. Mel Gibson had bought the rights and, sat on it for 10 years while he made box office duds like Braveheart and Passion of the Christ, which I hear both tanked.
But you didn't write the script for the movie.
I didn't write the script, no. I've never really wanted to write a script. But David Sachs, it took him 18 months, but he wrested the rights away from Mel Gibson and then made the movie. And David is he and Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and a couple of others invented PayPal, and they sold it to eBay. For $1.4 billion.
And David Sachs is now a
He's
White House advisor.
He's our crypto czar.
So let me ask you about another book you wrote, Florence of Arabia. Is that right? Now, what was that about?
Well, that was my 9/11 novel. I was filled with anger, rage, as we all were, but and I thought I have to write about this somehow. So the conceit of the book is a young woman who, formerly of the State Department, comes up with the idea of changing the entire Middle Eastern mindset by empowering women. So she goes over there and with sort of a hand-picked posse attempts to do that. But I came up really with the title. Once I had that title, I figured I have to write the book. At the premiere of the movie Lawrence of Arabia, Noel Coward said to Peter O'Toole, if you were any better looking, you'd be Florence of Arabia.
So when you write a book, how long does it take you to actually do the writing? And do you know how the book's going to turn out when you start?
Well, I had a couple of early disasters with let's not plot this. Let's just let our characters, let's see what they do. And, that can turn out well, or it can turn out not well, where you find yourself in a terminal cul-de-sac or whatever.
But when you're writing, you know pretty much how you want it to come out in the
Well,
end.
I then started plotting very
Okay.
closely. I mean, my outlines would be 90 to 100 pages long.
So when you write, you write on computer, right? You use a computer to write it. And then how long does it take you to typically finish one of your satires? Is that a year?
73 years. I'm plagiarizing a Winston Churchill anecdote, and I'm in no way comparing myself to Winston Churchill. But he gave a very good speech, as he was wont to do. And someone went up to him afterwards and said, "Winston, that was bloody marvelous. How long did it take you to write that?" And his reply was 64 years.
So you would say all your experience goes into it, but you typically take how long? If you don't say this.
Well, call it a year.
So when
My father used to write his books in 6 weeks, which is one reason I should hate him, but I don't.
did you ever criticize your father's book? Did he ever show you the books and say, "What do you think of them?"
Sure.
And would you tell him?
Well, I would, I would be as honest as I could. He wrote some really great books. Some of the novels I don't think, are qualify as literary gems. So I would be gentle. He one day I remember he said, "Oh, for my next book, I'm going to write a book about Elvis Presley." And I should have said, "No," but I didn't. It ended up being called Elvis in the Morning.
One time you wrote your father, you wrote a book and you showed it to your father and he came back with one sentence saying, "It doesn't do it for me." Wasn't that kind of deflating?
It was a P.S. in a letter. It said, "Sorry, this one didn't work for me."
Isn't that kind of deflating to get that from your father?
Well, it didn't fill me with joy, but it wasn't a book he was going to love.
Now, you wrote a book that is a non-fiction book, but it's very funny, called Losing Mom and Pup, which was about the period of time when your mother died and then your father not too long after died. Was that very hard to write that book about your parents? And were you criticized by your parents' friends for telling secrets of the family that probably nobody but you knew and nobody would ever know if you hadn't written that book?
It's not a book I ever planned to write. I did not know the night before I started writing it the next day that I was going to write that book. But I watched, my parents died within 11 months of each other. And I just started writing it. And it's the only book of mine that I could say wrote itself. I looked at my calendar after and noted that it had taken 40 days, by which I don't imply any biblical meaning. But I say somewhere early on in the book, if for better or for worse, I'm a writer. And if the universe hands you material like this, as the son of two, suffice to say, larger than life characters, not telling that story would seem almost to be an act of denial. Here's the thing about the book, because it's ironic. All my life, David, I have tried to be something other than just Bill Buckley's son. But that book sold like hotcakes, and it's still selling. Well, maybe like crepes, but it's my best-selling book so far, hundreds of thousands of copies. And so the joke may be on me, that, I mean, this, to the extent I'm remembered at all, 50 years from now, this might be the book they remember me for, the book about being Bill Buckley.
In the book, you talk about how your father loved to sail across oceans, not just around lakes, across oceans, even if it was a storm coming or he knew it was going to be terrible, and you went with him. What, did you ever think you were going to lose your life in some of these things? And did you ever tell your father this isn't going to work? And what did he say?
Oh, I think you're overreacting. One, I'll give you an instance. October of 1996, I'm on my way on the not Acela to Stanford because we're going to, it's October, we're going to go have a cocktail cruise on his 36-foot sailboat. And as I look out the window of the train, the landscape begins to resemble more and more the opening of The Wizard of Oz, you know, objects flying through. I mean, I swear that I saw a cow go by. And so we pull into Stanford, and there's Pop sort of standing on the platform, and he's kind of holding on to a stanchion or something. And this was, you know, seeing my dad waiting for me at the station was always a sight to tug at my heart. So the doors open, you know, got sound, and I was practically blown back into the train by the wind. And so I sort of crawled out, and he says, "We'll have a brisk sail." And I said, "We're going out in this?" He said, "Sure, why not?" Winds gusting 55 miles an hour. We get out there and barely make it to Oyster Bay and barely make it back. And my mother, we get to the house, my mother's on the phone. She said, "I've been on the line to the Coast Guard for the last 3 hours. And they keep saying, 'But Mrs. Buckley, we don't understand. What is he doing out there?'" To which the answer was, "Good question." He was, great men are, you know, complicated.
Was he a good sailor, actually?
He was that's a complicated question. Yes, he was a good sailor, but he was reckless. I mean, no, I wrote him the most furious letter I've ever written him after that. I said, we had no business being out there. When we got back to Connecticut, everyone was without power. There, you know, 750 homes in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York were out of power. The governors had declared a state of emergency.
But you also...
So it made no sense. But as I wrote in that book, The Height of Vanity, to quote one book, you know, great men, my father's a great men always have too much sail up. You know, timorous souls like myself, they see a storm on the horizon, they take in sail. Not Pop. You know, he was always pushing, I guess Tom Wolfe in his magnificent book on the astronauts called it Pushing the Envelope.
So when you were growing up, I assume you had the most famous people in the United States coming over for dinner every night. Were you in awe of some of these people, or you didn't really care?
Norman Mailer came to dinner once. I guess I was 11. And with the wife, he subsequently stabbed with a penknife. I don't know why I laughed. It's not particularly funny. It certainly wasn't much fun for Mrs. Mailer. And poor Norman Mailer was made to read my 2-page school paper on Benjamin Franklin. It wasn't my idea. Pop said, "Oh, why don't you show Mr. Mailer?" I was going, and so somewhere in the garage is that paper signed by Norman Mailer to Christopher Buckley, a promising young writer. I should use it as a blurb.
So,
But yeah, there were a lot of the King of Spain came to spend the weekend. Well, I say King of Spain, he was the pretender, but he, if his father hadn't abdicated, he would be the king. So it was, so he came to spend the weekend. I was 5.
So
I'll just tell it real quick. And so my mother went into a frenzy of redecoration and, redid the guest room, with framed things that looked like they had come from 15th century Spain. The basic statement, fashion, decorative statement was, this is where our kings sleep. And the next morning early, my mother is walking by his bedroom, Juan Carlos's bedroom. And she hears a plaintive cry, "But Christopher, we have already read Donald Duck twice." And I had gotten all my comic books and crawled into bed with him. And so I perhaps am one of the few people who can say he had Donald Duck read to him by the King of Spain.
So one of your father's very good friends was Henry Kissinger.
Yeah.
Did he come over the house very much, or did you get to know Henry Kissinger?
I did.
And he gave your father eulogy.
He did. He did.
At St. Patrick's Cathedral.
He did.
Is it hard to get a funeral at memorial service at St. Patrick's Cathedral?
Well, I also gave a eulogy, and it opened by saying that Pop and I had talked about this day, and he said, if I'm still famous, see if the cardinal will accommodate you, but if not, just tuck me away at St. Mary's in Stamford. I then said, well, Pop, I guess you're still famous. And 2,200 people agreed.
Well, your father
applauding.
wanted to be cremated and his ashes put with your mother in a cross on your front lawn. How come you didn't follow their wishes?
Pop commissioned a beautiful bronze crucifix, really quite stunning, by the Connecticut sculptor Jimmy Knowles. And yes, the idea was Mom would be in a canister in one arm, and his ashes would be a canister in the other. Now, it's a few months before Pop is dying, and we're having the conversation. And I had no intention of living in the house in which I grew up, where the cross was. I foresaw selling it. So I said to Pop, well, Pop, in the event of a sale, the new owner might not, want a 7-foot-high crucifix in the garden. He said, why not? I said, why not? Well, he said, it's a work of art. I said, yes. So I could imagine, I flashed forward, imagining giving the tour to the prospective owners and say, now Mr. and Mrs. Birnbaum, about the crucifix. So but there the story doesn't quite end, because so he dies, and I bury him in corpore, in a coffin, with Mom's ashes on his lap, in the Buckley family plot in Sharon, Connecticut, where he grew up. And I moved the cross up there, so the cross overlooks the plot. I then ended up keeping the house.
So you're living there now?
I'm living there now.
And the place where you're...
And Pop, that humming sound you hear is Pop centrifuging in his coffin. But honestly, my intentions were to sell the house.
What's it like you're working in the garage your father had as his office? Is that your office now? And
It
what's
is.
it like to be in the same place he wrote 57 books and did all those other things?
And
Intimidating?
And indeed, where he died at his desk. It's humbling. It's humbling. I am, not 1/50th, the man my father was, but I need an office, and it's available. I find that parents don't mind if you move back in as long as they're dead.
So you've written a book called Make Russia Great Again. What was that about? Where'd you get the idea for that title?
It's another parody White House memoir. This one by Mr. Trump's seventh or eighth chief of staff, a guy named Herb Nutterman. And his prior experience he was the food and beverage manager at Mr. Trump's hotel Farago-sur-Mer, and he's called in. So it's it's comic. The Washington Post paid it a very nice compliment in its review by Ron Charles, saying, "Buckley has done the impossible. He has made politics funny again."
So if
I liked that.
somebody's watching and says, "I want to be Christopher Buckley. I want to be able to write."
My advice would be, don't.
Well, somebody
Do
would
not.
say they'd like.
Do
You've written 20 books, bestsellers. You're a well-known writer, raconteur, good speech maker, speech writer. Somebody says, "I want to have the wit that he has." Where do you develop wit? Is that a matter of living a certain experience, or do you kind of just dream it up as you're sitting there writing away? How do you get wit, and how do you recommend somebody who writes these kind of books that you wrote? How would you recommend somebody do that?
Well, you're overly generous. To the extent that I have, as you say, wit. I'm not sure it's something you can sort of. I don't think. I mean, the idea of taking a course at college and how to be witty. Right. I would probably flunk that course. I think it's not a very good answer to your good question, but I think it's just a way of looking at the world. And in my case, probably based mostly on deficiencies in everything else, math scores, getting your facts straight. I don't, it's not a talent I particularly esteem. I would much rather be Walter Isaacson or John Meacham or Evan Thomas. I regard biography as probably the highest of the literary arts.
Well, if you had to live your life all over again, would you go into politics, or would you want to go into something important like private equity, or?
I would, you asked me outside if I would ever encourage someone to be a writer.
You have 3 children. You want them to be writers?
No, but none of them want to be writers. So I've been spared that. I would say to a young person I would encourage a young person who had some recognizable, just a speck of actual talent. I would never say, "Oh, you too, you can be a writer," but I would also say, do it. Make the writing your side hustle. because if you want to live at all well, writing is a highly, highly, highly speculative way to earn a living.
When you're reading somebody, let's suppose, who do you like to read? You mentioned a couple authors, but when you read, whose books do you like to read?
Well, I read a lot, and more and more, I listen to books. You know, book sales are down, but Audible books are on the rise. And I wish it had been, remember books on tape where you would get 12 cassettes and if you flipped the box over, it had return postage. I read, well, yeah, I would say I read all the time. I read widely.
You like fiction or nonfiction more?
I read mostly nonfiction, but I've just discovered the Irish writer Sebastian Barry, and this guy is so good, it takes my breath away. And you know, Amor Towles, Colson Whitehead. No, I do read fiction, but I probably read 7 or 8 nonfiction books too every.
If you could meet any author you've ever read the books of, living or not alive now, what author would you like to actually meet? Your most respected author?
Herman Melville. Moby Dick is probably the only 600-page book I've read 10 times. I think he was Hemingway famously said that all American writing comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn. I would flip that. I think Melville is our great literary.
He couldn't sell any copies of Moby Dick initially. They couldn't sell.
It didn't sell out. It was botched. He made his lifetime earnings from Moby Dick were $536. We don't know where the manuscript is, but it's a book that even on the 9th, 10th, 11th reading doesn't fail to raise the hairs on my arm. I'm not talking about the 400 pages on blubber. You can do a little skipping, but to me, that's the American literary cathedral.
So a final question about your father. What would you like people to know about him that maybe they didn't know? You put some of that in your book. I don't have enough time to go through it all now, but the thing about your father that people didn't know that you think people should know about your well-known father?
That he was a Christian gentleman of the highest order. He was the most generous, forgiving, tolerant, and fun man I've ever known. And I mean, a lot of people sort of think he was some Attila the Hun of politics, but if you look at his record, you'll find some anomalies. He was agitating for an African American U.S. president back in 1970. He was early on. He called for the decriminalization of the drug laws. He was in many areas. His thinking was unconventional and not classically conservative.
Well, look, I think we're out of time, but I want to thank you for coming down and talking about your own writing career, talking about your parents as well, and it's a pleasure to talk with you, and I hope you write some more satire soon, okay?
Thank you, Dave. Thank you.
After the interview, Christopher Buckley and David Rubenstein toured the historic Decatur House.
So what they've tried to do, this is really operated by the White House Historical Association, which was created by Jackie Kennedy in 1961. And at the time, it was very controversial to create that, and nobody had done that before. And what they wanted to do was to have a pamphlet that says, here's what the White House is like, here's how we restored it. And the President of the United States, John Kennedy, said, no, we shouldn't do that because it'll look like we're commercializing the White House. It was sold for 50
That was a gentler time.
Yes, 50 cents is what it cost. And it was very difficult to get the President and his staff to agree to it. Finally, they relented, they did it. But President Kennedy did not actually support preserving this as much as you might think, because he actually signed an executive order taking all these townhouses which were run down and basically tearing them down, and they were going to be new buildings. After he died, Mrs. Kennedy persuaded Lyndon Johnson to reverse the executive order that President Kennedy had signed, and he preserved all of these buildings, so they were restored and so forth, and that's why they're still here.
Well, God bless Jackie Kennedy. She also saved New York's Grand Central Station.
She did.
Who, believe it or not,
Oh, she did.
there were developers who wanted to tear it down, and she and Brendan Gill of the New Yorker magazine organized and stopped it.
She also tried to keep the tall buildings from having their shadow on the Central Park, but that didn't work eventually after she passed away. They built those buildings. But you know,
That's what my mother used to call problems of the idle rich.
right, well, so Jackie Kennedy was hard to believe, but she, you know, we were younger, but she died at just 64 years old.
Yeah, far too soon. She was quite a lady.
So
And this would be Mr. Decatur.
Right.
Yes.
And so what they've tried to do is restore this to, if not the furniture that was here then, furniture that is of that period.
Right. Would that be a, well, I guess that's a harpsichord.
Right, correct.
Rather than a clavichord. My memory, David, is that he died, they moved him to the ground floor after he was mortally wounded.
Right. And,
Do we know which room?
You're standing in it.
One could only have reverence standing in this room.
See more with Christopher Buckley at Decatur House, and watch past episodes of America's Book Club at cspan.org/abc and C-SPAN's YouTube page.